Hey there, I am live again. Nobody out there watching. But I was sitting watching another live stream and thought, why am I watching this when I could just have my own and start uh, read some more? Because frankly, I want to read the book and it's like pretty interesting. And I noticed I had only just gotten to the end of near the end of chapter 2 there. If I just stuck it out for a little longer. Oh, they cut me off. If I just stuck it out for a little longer, I would have finished the chapter. So I'm going to see how it goes. And I just had dinner. I was supposed to have a club event tonight, but unfortunately that was canceled. It's funny that somebody would come on and then go off. Probably. There's Rio, my boy, in the background. My love. He's such a good dog, man. So lucky to have you, guy. Hey, Rio. So yeah, I was supposed to have a club event tonight, but got canceled because of the weather. It's like snow and the ferries are canceled and all this kind of stuff. So uh, I've been reading Brutal, the untold story of Kevin Weeks' life inside Whitey Bulger's Irish mob. I was saying earlier that I ended up on a little bit too soon, so I wanted to at least finish it. It was only a few more pages. So I'll carry on from this morning. I was on page 48. Jimmy was taking a bigger interest in me, talking more to me and watching me more intently, noticing everything I did or said the night he was there. A few years later in 79, Billy O'Neill, who was 29 at the time, locked himself out of his apartment and climbed up on a drain pipe to get inside. When the drain pipe broke away from the wall, he turned to jump and ended up hitting the back of his head on the fender of a car beneath him. I visited him every day at the New England Medical Center, but was told there was no hope of recovery. 6 days after the accident, he died, a good person and a loyal friend. Billy had worked the door with me many nights, and I took his death hard. Kevin naturally took it much worse, spending less time at the bar. As a result, I ended up managing the bar along with a cook named Mike Whitmarsh, settling the bar's cash registers at the end of the night, working nearly every night, often from 7 till the place closed, and still laying track full time for the MBTA. My schedule was pretty full then. In addition, I was spending time with Jimmy before I went to Triple O's. Since I knew everybody there and liked being around the wise guys and the music, I never felt like I was working that hard. The fact that I was always sober and didn't drink on the job made things easier for me because you never knew what was going on or what was going to happen when you worked the door there, or who was going to come walking through it. About a month after Billy died, when Kevin was still having a real tough time dealing with the loss, Ray Flynn, a Massachusetts state legislator and Boston city councilor, who later became a 3-term mayor of Boston and U.S. ambassador to the Vatican, came into Triple O's around midnight and immediately called Kevin Billy. I could see that Flynn had already been drinking that night, but he wasn't drunk. I corrected him right away, but he kept on calling Kevin by his dead brother's name. Naturally, Kevin was getting aggravated, so I told Flynn, "Come on, What are you doing? You used to go drinking with Billy. You knew him well. Yeah, you're right, he said to me. Then he turned around and did it again. That night he was talking to anyone who would listen about Ireland and all the things he'd done for the Irish people. He'd come in alone and had settled himself at the same end of the bar near the door where Kevin and I were standing alone, along with a few of the regulars. Sure enough, while he was talking, he kept calling Kevin Billy. Billy is dead, I said after I had corrected him 3 or 4 times. Don't be an asshole. And then he turned, or he stared on me. And then he started on me. Fuck you, he said. I didn't ask him to repeat that 3 more times. I knocked him out with one punch. He fell right on out of the door, down the 3 stairs in the front of the bar, and landed on the sidewalk. Kevin came of the door out the door and told him, "You're barred from here for life. And if you're reincarnated, you're still barred." How many people could say they knocked out the mayor of Boston and ambassador to the Vatican? A few nights later, while I was working the door, 2 fellows in their mid-20s and dressed in suits pulled up in a Mercedes and walked into the bar. Guys from the Gillette corporate headquarters often came in dressed in suits, so that wasn't that unusual. The 2 fellows went halfway down the bar and sat down at a table. A few minutes later, a waitress came up to me and said, "Kevin, you better go down and take a look at those 2 guys." I walked down and saw that they had a bag of cocaine out on their table. "Fellows, you can't do that here," I told them. "You have to put it away." "No problem," they told me, and I walked back to the front of the bar. No more than 10 minutes went by before the waitress came back and said, "Kevin, they're putting the stuff back on the table." I headed back to them and said, "Fellas, I already told you that you can't do that here. Go out and do it in your car. You can't do it in the bar." 2 minutes later, I looked back at them, and there they were. Yeah, this series is really popular, eh? 0 watching, 0 thumbs up. What a joke. I see some shit, real garbage on the freaking net, and this ain't it. Besides, it's for me. I'm gonna make myself smarter by reading all these books, whether anybody watches it, likes it, or subscribes or not. So, they continued doing lines on the table with a credit card. I walked back down and wiping the coke off the table with my hand said, "I already fucking told you twice. Now get the fuck out of here." "Hey, what's your problem?" one of them yelled. Get out of here, screw," I repeated. When the 3 of us got to the door, they started arguing with me. "You don't know who the fuck I am," the one said. Yeah, I said, "just screw. Get out of here." With that, one of the guys threw a punch at me. I stepped to the side and hit him a right hand, and he went down, falling over backward and hitting his head on the ground. I turned and hit his friend a left hook to the jaw, and he went down too. Thinking that was the end of it, I walked back into Triple O's. A week later, I overheard 2 waitresses in the bar, Vicky and Pat, talking. Vicky, who was about 4 years older than me, well built with short blonde hair and a great personality, was telling Pat, "Yeah, you have to tell him." But Pat was saying, "No, I'm not getting involved. I'm staying out of it." Finally, Vicky came up to me and Kevin O'Neill and told us that Pat's mother checked coats in the Beef and Ale restaurant on Washington Street in town. She had heard the owner, whose last name was Spelios, telling people he was going to spend money even if he had to sell his place to have me killed for fracturing his son's skull and was reaching out to Jack Ashley, an ex-Boston cop. Ashley, who was around 6'5", 250 pounds, was now a loan shark with a reputation of being capable guy who could handle himself. I couldn't not tell you, Vicky said, because if anything ever happened to you, I'd feel horrible. Kevin assured me he knew Jack Ashley personally, and he would reach out to him and let him know I was with him and Jimmy. He also told me and Ashley always carried a .22 Derringer under his hat. The following week, Kevin and I were in the bar when Jack Ashley walked in. Kevin talked to him for a few minutes and then called me over. The three of us were walking into an alcove beneath the stairs leading to the function room when Jack made the mistake of reaching to take his hat off. Assuming he was going for a gun, I immediately pulled out a .38 pistol and stuck it in his chest. Whoa, hold on, Kevin said. Hey, I don't know anything about anything that's been going on here, Jack said, putting his right hand up in the air. I've been out of town for a week, and all I know is that Kevin wants to talk to me. I put my pistol away and let Kevin explain everything about the coke and the guys in the bar. Later that night, when Kevin and I were standing at the bar with Jack, Stevie, and Jimmy walked in, and we told them about the fight and Spelio's plan to have them killed, or have me killed. The next day, the two of them went to see Spelio's and explained I was with them and that his kid was wrong. Yeah, well, my son ended up with a fractured skull, and the other kid a broken jaw. Spelios began to tell Jimmy and Stevie. Listen, Jimmy interrupted him. You're reaching out to have this guy killed. Well, we're going to let him go after your son, or we're going to let him go after your son. How's that? It didn't take long for the father to decide to let the whole thing go. But Jimmy and Stevie ended up making him pay a fine, basically for wanting to hit me when I was with Jimmy. His kid never came back into Triple O's, and I didn't spend any time at the Beef and Ale. After Billy died, there seemed to be more fights, and as always, Jimmy was taking notice of how I handled them. It helped that, like Jimmy, I had grown up in a neighborhood and knew and dealt with the younger people. When I rode around and did some occasional business with him, I was also learning that he was a pretty fair person, and that although he had a penchant for violence and most people were afraid of him, he used violence only as a last resort when all else fails. Finally, a few years after Billy died in '82, one especially busy night at Triple O's, Jimmy said to Kevin O'Neill, Kevin's fighting. He's watching out for your interest at the bar, and he's not making any money. You should make it worth his while. Why don't you give him 25% of this place? But Kevin wasn't interested in doing that. And I can't blame him for not wanting to give up 25% of his place to me. When he said no, Jimmy said, I'm taking him with me. Like Stevie Fleming later said, Jimmy captured Kevin at an early age. He might have been right, but no one ever put a gun to my head. I went willingly. Okay, so that's the end of chapter 2. I would ask if anybody would like for me to keep reading, but there's nobody here, so, and my dogs don't talk, so. But yeah, that's 52 pages into this very interesting book, 1442. I think I'm going to keep reading and say fuck the universe. Okay, so chapter 3, breaking in the Halloran murder. Brian Halloran had been lucky 2 times earlier when he'd escaped the bullets aimed for his balloon-shaped head. But Jimmy Flynn and Jimmy Mantville, not Jimmy Bulger, had been shooting them. Once Jimmy Bulger decided to take him out, Halloran never stood a chance. It was just luck. I'm not sure if it was good or bad luck that made me a crucial part of Halloran's unlucky day. Since I was the only one Jimmy trusted, uh, who happened to be around on the afternoon of May 11th, 1982, I got the call, and answered, once I answered it, there would be no turning back. It turned out to be a day that ended Halloran's life and permanently changed mine. Brian Halloran, a 42-year-old Winter Will hanger-on the Winter Hill hanger-on the Winter Hill gang had gotten its name from a neighborhood in the Somerville, Massachusetts, where some well-known criminals had teamed up. They had played a central role in the Boston gang wars of the 1960s. Back in the late 1960s and early 1970s, Jimmy had joined forces with the Winter Hill and Stevie Fleming, who was already involved with them. The gang had members of various ethnic backgrounds, including the Italian, Irish, and Polish. They were all independent, well-known, violent criminals who had joined forces in '79. 21 members and associates, including one of its leaders, Howie Winter, had been indicted by federal prosecutors for racetrack fixing. Jimmy and Stevie basically took over the Winter Hill rackets, and though some of the members like Joe McDonald and Johnny Martorano were on the run, the gang continued on. But Halloran was also a bully who'd ended a life himself. To be specific, he had taken out George Pappas, a reputed drug dealer in Chinatown restaurant, the Golden Dragon, a year earlier. I'm not quite sure what the murder was about, probably drugs, most likely cocaine. As it turned out, Halloran had one of his first strokes of good luck here. Jackie Salimi got nabbed for the murder, and after he served a few years, the case was overturned. Salami walked, and the case remained unsolved. So in 1982, Halloran was trying to trade info to get off of on a future case against Pappas involving him, and headed to the FBI with stories about Jimmy. Only one group of FBI agents believed his shit. The other camp didn't believe his story because he made his worth to the Winter Hill gang more than it was. A lot of them knew Jimmy didn't like Halloran and wouldn't use him for any jobs. But the info that Halloran was talking came straight through to Jimmy from sources he had at the FBI. So it didn't make any difference what any FBI guys thought. Of course, at the time, I knew nothing about Jimmy's other relationship with the FBI and merely knew that he'd paid money to his sources at the agency for information about the law and his crimes. Halloran's first story was that Jimmy and Stevie had asked him to murder Tulsa millionaire Roger Wheeler. Wheeler had bought World JLI, a sports betting enterprise with headquarters in Florida and Connecticut in 1978, and was beginning to figure out that Jimmy and Stevie were skimming money, extorting $1 million a year from the company's Connecticut operation. Jimmy and Stevie had gotten involved with the operation through former FBI agent Paul Rico, who was now head of security at JLI. Actually, it was the Winter Hill mob hitman Johnny Martor- Martorano who ended up taking care of Wheeler at his Tulsa, Oklahoma golf course, shooting him between his eyes as he got into his Cadillac after a round of golf. When Halloran refused to take a lie detector test about his role in the murder plan that turned out to be fuel for the camp that thought he was a liar, which he was. The idea of Jimmy offering Halloran a contract was bullshit. The second piece of info Halloran was feeding the FBI was closer to the truth. It had to do with the murder of Louis Latif, one of Jimmy's bookmakers in April 1980. I remember the date well because Louis was invited to my wedding later that month, and Pam and I were having a hard time with the seating arrangements. We couldn't figure out where to put Louis because he was loud, abrasive guy, and certain people didn't like him. I had no trouble with Jimmy's table where we sat Stevie, Jody Pretzi, Freddie Weichel, Kevin O'Neill, and others, but Louis was harder. When I told Jimmy I didn't know where to put Louis at the wedding, he told me, "Don't worry about it. He probably won't show." And he was right. A bookmaker in his late 40s, Louis had made things hard for himself when he suddenly decided he wanted to be a bad guy and started killing people. The first person Louis shot was a guy in his early 30s named Lip Mongelio. Louis and Lip were involved in a card game at Hap's Lounge in South Boston, a bar Louis owned with his partner, Jimmy Matero. Lip accused Louis of cheating, which he was, and when an argument ensued, Louis shot Lip 4 or 5 times, but Lip survived. The next day, Jimmy told me all about it. It seems that right after he shot Lip, Louis had been walking down Broadway when Jimmy drove by. Jimmy pulled over to the sidewalk and asked Louis, "What are you doing?" And Louis said, "I just shot Lip, and I'm going to turn myself in to the police." Obviously, it was Louis' first time shooting anyone, and he panicked. He was a bookmaker, not a violent criminal, so there was there he was, heading for the District 6 police station near D and West West Broadway. "What are you, crazy?" Jimmy asked him. Get in here." Jimmy put him in the car, calmed Louis down, and dropped him off at his house. Then Jimmy sent Alan Thistle, a fucking piece of shit in the street, who later became an informant for the FBI, to talk to Lip in the hospital. This the guy's name's Thistle, I see. Thistle persuaded Lip to not testify against Louis, and everything was dropped. After all, Louis was also a good moneymaker. No reason to send a profitable bookmaker away for attempted murder. A few days later, however, Louis decided he wanted to kill Alan Thistle for no reason other than he just didn't like him. But Jimmy told him he couldn't. He just talked the kid out of pressing charges against him, and now you want to kill him? Jimmy said he did you a big favor, and that was the end of that. But a month or so later, Louis made things more complicated, even when he got into an argument during another card game, this time with his partner, Jimmy Matera. Matera caught Louis cheating and slapped him in the face during the game. About a week later, they were having problems at the bar with an outrageous water bill, and Louis convinced Matera there must be something wrong with the water meter. When the two of them went down to the cellar, Louis told him Louis told Jimmy to take a look at the water meter, which he said was broken. While Matera was staring at the meter, Louis shot him in the head for slapping him. Unfortunately for Louis, there was a witness, Bobby Conrad, the bartender who was working that night. Conrad, around 50, was a nervous wreck over what he had seen, so Louis wined and dined him in Las Vegas. Then he took him to a little place he had up in Nova Scotia, where he promised to hide him till everything blew over, assuring him everything would be fine and had nothing to worry about. He killed him then or there, took him out of the back of the house in a wheelbarrow and buried him. He ended up hiding him so well that, thanks to the laws in Canada limiting their access to search for bodies, the DEA and state police couldn't find him. Oh, that's crazy, eh? After that murder, Louis came back to Boston, convinced now that he was a killer. It didn't take long for him to have another falling out with a partner, this time with Joe the barber, a barber by trade and his partner in the bookmaking operation. One night around 11, Louis strolled into Triple O's dressed in his usual stylish manner, perfectly groomed, his fingernails manicured, a flat scally or a newsboy cap covering the balding top of his dark hair. Anxious for people to notice him, Louis's clothes were always color coordinated, like if he wore a red jacket or shirt, he put on red shoes. He had green shoes to go with his green jacket and so on. That night, he was decked out in black flared leg pants, a black silk shirt open at the neck, and a short black leather jacket, black shiny shoes, gold chains, and rings. That was Louis. He wasn't a big guy, maybe 5'7" and 185 pounds, of Arab descent. He had a mustache like Saddam Hussein. He also had a wife and a couple of kids, and a three-decker townhouse on East Broadway, and GI. Was friendly with his daughter Luann, who was a few years younger than me. That night, as always, he was talking in his obnoxious loud voice. Even when there were 400 people in the bar, you always knew Louis was there. Jimmy was standing by the front door at his usual place at the edge of the L-shaped bar. I was by the door, bouncing maybe 6 or 7 feet away. Louis came in with his loud, "Hey, Jimmy, how you doing?" and ordered a round of drinks for Jimmy and Kevin O'Neill and whoever else was there. There was a lot of small talk at the beginning, but Louis brought up Joe the barber and accused him of stealing money from the business. Jimmy knew the truth was just the opposite, that Louis had recently been stealing money and selling drugs without paying Jimmy. He told Louis that Joe was a good guy and that he trusted him completely. The conversation, I could see, was getting Jimmy mad. "You stepped over the line," he told Louis. "Now you're a killer and people are going to treat you differently. If there's a problem, no one's going to just talk to you about it. They'll know you're capable of killing someone, so when they have a problem with you, they're going to want to kill you. You're no longer just a bookmaker." Jimmy's voice was getting deeper and more pronounced, quieter and lower in tone, with stronger emphasis on each word he spoke. I knew right away that was a dangerous sign. I also noticed that the corner of his mouth was curling up and his eyes were turning bloodshot. Since I was bouncing, I wasn't drinking, and I observed everything clearly. I could always I could always tell. I could always tell when Jimmy was getting mad. He has these crystal clear blue eyes, and when he gets angry, they run from blue to bloodshot. It's like a Dracula movie when Christopher Lee is about to bite his victim, excuse me, and you can see the red veins in his eyes. It was the same thing with Jimmy. I could see that Jimmy's blood was boiling and his blood pressure was rising, but Louis had a couple beers in him and he didn't pick up the danger signs. I got nothing to worry about, Louis told Jimmy. I got you as a friend. He says, we're not friends anymore, Louis, Jimmy said coldly, but Louis just laughed and tried to shake it off like Jimmy was joking, or this was a mere scolding. But I knew Jimmy was dead serious, and I also knew Louis had a problem. He was acting like a fool, talking about killing Joe the barber, thinking he was on equal footing with Jimmy, that he was a killer now and Jimmy would respect him for that. He couldn't have been more wrong. Personally, I liked Louis. Every Sunday night he'd come down to Triple O's and we'd play cards or pinball, $20 a game. He was loud but funny and had always been a good money maker for Jimmy. He should have just stayed a bookie and not tried to jump from the minor leagues to the majors. Now he wanted to kill a friend of Jimmy's. There was no way that would be allowed. Ooh, boy, that's interesting. Right? Now, shortly after that, a week or so before my wedding, Louis was found stuffed into a garbage bag in the trunk of his car, which had been dumped in the South End. He'd been stabbed with an ice pick and shot. He was color coordinated, Jimmy told me. He was wearing green underwear and was in a green garbage bag. At the wedding, when I went around to greet his table, Jimmy pointed to the empty chair beside him and said, say hello to Louis. Say hi to Louis. Steve picked up a napkin and made like he was wiping his face. He keeps on drinking and it keeps on leaking out of him. He said, reminding us that Louis had been shot in the head and any drink he might have put to his mouth would pour right out of his face. And they all broke out laughing. Louis's family wouldn't have thought it was that funny. The day after Jimmy took care of Louis, his nephew went to South End to pick up his uncle's car. When he got back to Southie, he opened the trunk and to get his golf clubs and found his uncle. No one was ever tried for Louis's murder, but now Halloran was putting himself at the scene. Halloran told the FBI he had driven down to Triple O's with Louis and that Jimmy and someone else were there when he dropped Louis off. He said Jimmy and that other person had killed Louis and carried him out the back door. Strangely enough, Jimmy told me Louis' last words to me were a lie. Apparently, Louis had insisted that he'd come by himself and that no one had driven him over. It was hard to figure out why Louis lied to Jimmy that night. If he told Jimmy that someone had driven him, he might have gotten a pass, but it wouldn't have lasted long since Jimmy had no intentions of letting Louis run wild. Now Halloran was playing just as dangerous a game as Louis and making fatal errors. The worst mistakes were coming back to Boston and trusting the FBI. Of course, FBI agent John Connolly was feeding Jimmy all the info about Halloran. Jimmy and Stevie talked about it in front of me, saying Halloran was lying, at least about the Wheeler case, figuring it was just a matter of time until Halloran was taken off the streets and put in witness protection. Jimmy went looking for him. I assumed we were just going to brace him, read him the riot act, but let him go. After all, if the FBI didn't believe him, why should we have to take him out? But I was new to the game and didn't understand all the ways in which Jimmy's mind moved, nor did I know all the goings on with the Wheeler murder. 26 years older then, 26 years old then, I was still holding on to my job at the MBTA, working from 7 to 4, laying track. I'd also been working for Jimmy for 5 years, and after work, I would head over to the Broadway appliance and furniture store on F and West Broadway that I now own with Kevin O'Neill to meet Jimmy and ride around with him for a few hours, collecting envelopes and beating up people. Even though Jimmy and I had opened a bar on F and West Side, or on West Second, called Courts Inn, I was still bouncing some nights and weekends at Triple O's from 9 to 2. I had more than a few jobs, but I needed the dough. At that time, I was a married man, and planning on starting a family. And I had other responsibilities too. Every Thursday from the time I'd graduated South Boston High and began to work full time, I'd go over to the house in the old colony projects at 8 Pilsudski Way, apartment 554, second floor, to give my mother an envelope. That was the right thing to do. I gave her cash, usually a couple hundred each week, most of it's money made working illegally from Jimmy. She was still suffering from her severe arthritis and other health problems. My father had a bad heart attack and couldn't work much. Mom was grateful for the money and always said thank you. My mother had heard things about me, but she chose not to believe them. Once I was involved in a fight with a kid who pulled a gun on me, then jumped in his car and took off. I hopped into my car and followed him, each of us shooting at the other through the windows. He drove through the old colony projects right to 8 Pilsudski Way, and I was still shooting at him out of my car window. My mother looked out the window and started yelling to my sister, Patty, to call the police. When Patty told her, Ma, that's Kevin, Ma said, oh my God, and moved away from the window. Anyhow, the day Jimmy went looking for Halloran, I'd just gotten off work at the T and was still dressed in my work clothes, dungarees and work boots. I was talking with Jimmy down at the Broadway in a appliance store when John, a capable fellow from Charleston and an old Winter Hill associate of Jimmy's, stopped by to shoot the shit. Casually, he mentioned that he'd just spotted Brian Halloran on a payphone outside the Pier restaurant on South Boston waterfront. John knew from conversation around certain criminal circles that Halloran was cooperating and that Jimmy had been looking for him for over a month. Jimmy also knew that the window of opportunity for taking out that piece of crap was closing. He wouldn't be left unprotected on the streets for long. Jimmy, John, and I got into our separate cars and headed to the Mullins Club at O and 3rd. Even though it was officially called CPAA, or City Point Athletics Association. Most people knew it as Mullins Club, which was also the place where the Mullins gang hung. Jimmy was driving his geez, my chair is falling down here. Jimmy, where the hell is it here? Jimmy was driving his green old Delta 88, and I was in my green Thunderbird. Jimmy walked into the Mullins Club to see if anyone else was around to help him. When he didn't find anyone, he told me to leave my car there and drive him over to Teresa Stanley's house on Silver Street in South Boston. When I dropped him off, he said I should head back to the Mullins Club. By then it was about 4:30 in the afternoon. I had no idea exactly what was going to happen, but I could tell that there was an urgency to whatever it was. I drove back down to the club where 15 minutes later, Jimmy pulled up wearing a light brown wig, floppy mustache, and dark clothes, driving a tow truck. The tow truck was basically a hit car, a modified high-performance blue 75 Malibu. We had nicknamed the tow truck, so if anyone ever picked us up talking about it on the radio, they would think we were talking about some tow truck. When Jimmy had bought it a year or so earlier, it was a two-tone. It's a long one, this chapter. Okay. It was a two-tone blue, but it had painted a dark, but he had painted a dark green. Jimmy had a master mechanic work on it according to his own specifications and garaged it on K Street. It was a beauty. Its engine all souped up with over 900 horsepower. Jimmy's mechanic had gone over it from head to toe. Shocks, springs, the transmission, the whole suspension system, the motor, the drive shaft, the rear end, every part of the car was high performance. From the motor to the rear suspension, everything had been replaced because with so much power, the weakest link would break under full acceleration. You could turn each light on or off with the flick of a switch. If you got in a chase, all the lights but the headlights could go off. So it would be hard for anyone to follow. Jimmy had a smoke screen put in it where enough thick fog would come out of the tailpipe to shut down an entire street. Really. The mechanic had added an extra oil well that was filled with Marvel mystery oil, which fed into the exhaust manifold. The heat from the exhaust manifold produced smoke that seeped out of the tailpipes and created a heavy fog. You hit a button and the oil would be pumped into the exhaust manifold and the red hot pipes would steam up. We tested it late one night and watched as it fogged out all of First Street. Jesus, just stuttering over my words like Joe Biden here. Let's try and do better. I know it's been a little bit here, 44 minutes of reading, so I'm just going to do an hour or so because I don't think we'll get through this full chapter. Thanks for the like. Whoever gave me a like, that's much appreciated. Yeah, there were also little nozzles on a pipe underneath the rear bumper that were pressurized so oil would shoot out of them. If you were getting chased as you went into a turn, you lay down the oil slick. You couldn't make the turn, but you could make the turn, but the cars behind you would spin out of control. It was like James Bond's Aston Martin, really, without the ejector seat. You wouldn't look at the car and not hear the roar of the engine. It literally growled. When you'd step on the accelerator, the car would stand up on its four wheels. The drive shaft, the whole engine would try to twist inside the car. I'd never seen such a phenomenal car. It looked like a ordinary Chevy Malibu, but only until you stepped on the gas. It was a beast. I had my own set of keys and would take it out at night once a week and make sure that everything worked. I'd be out on the Southwest Expressway or the Mass Turnpike going 90 miles an hour, and I'd step on the gas and the car would leave rubber. If a cop ever went after me for speeding, I wasn't stopping. One night when I had the car out on the turnpike, a Porsche Targa 911 and a Corvette blew by me, so I stepped on the gas. The car took off like a rocket and I shot by the two of them. The needle to the speedometer was buried at 160 and the car was still accelerating. Jimmy hardly ever drove it, but he would have been bullshit. But he would have been bullshit if he ever saw me racing down the, I don't know what that means, pissed off. But he would have been bullshit if he ever saw me racing down the turnpike that night. The tow truck was just another example of how far ahead Jimmy thought. There wasn't one tiny detail that wasn't perfect on that car as a escape vehicle. It showed how 98% of his life was business, with maybe 2% pleasure. While other guys might be out drinking, he'd be thinking. While other people would be going to sleep at night, he'd be up planning. He was disciplined and lived and breathed the life of crime, which explains why he is still out there today rather than in a jail cell. Even though we tested the tow truck different features together, I'd taken it out many times. Seeing Jimmy pull up with the wig and mustache was the first time I'd ever seen him use it for real and in broad daylight. But the minute I saw him, I thought, this ain't good. Actually, he looked just like Jimmy Flynn, an old-time Winter Hill associate. Flynn and Jimmy Mantville, who had been a part of the original Mullins gang on the other side from Jimmy when the gang wars broke out in Southie in the late 1960s and early 70s, had allegedly made two prior attempts on Halloran. The story that was circulating was that both Flynn and Mantville had attempted to get Halloran because he was talking on them about a bank or armored car robbery they were allegedly involved in. One attempt had been at Halloran's house, and the second at a teachers' union hall parking lot. Both times he got shot at, but they missed and he'd escaped uninjured. This time I was sitting in my car, staring at Jimmy in the tow truck, thinking there would be no escape for Halloran. I wasn't upset or nervous or scared. It was a whole different feeling, with all my senses heightened and the adrenaline starting to flow big time. I'd only seen Halloran twice in my life. Both times at the Black Rose in Faneuil Hall, but I knew time was running out for him, and I knew I was a part of that fact. But as I learned earlier in life, the human mind can justify anything, and I was having no problem justifying my role here. After all, once Jimmy made his mind up that Halloran had to go, it was going to happen. With or without me, Jimmy was tapping me for the job, and there would be no way I could walk away. Not that I would I'd want to. I was working for the top gangster in the city, a cold-blooded murderer, and I'd always known that if he asked me to kill someone, I would do it. It didn't bother me to live like this. I knew a lot of people couldn't handle what was about to happen. They'd become a nervous wreck, but it didn't faze me at least. I had come to accept the fact that someday, sooner or later, I'd be involved in a murder. We were, I understood, brutal people. We hurt a lot of people. I wasn't hanging around with Boy Scouts. The truth was that I genuinely liked Jimmy. To me, he was a great guy. We shared a lot of laughs, and I always saw the good side of him. Sure, I'd seen his temper, but it had never been directed at me. The two of us worked well together. I had a reputation for fighting with my hands, so moving from boxing to bouncing to working for Jimmy was a natural progression for me. It carried a lot of prestige. My father was pleased with me working for the top gangster in the city. Someone most people in Southie respected for helping people in need, and used to say to me, "Listen and learn." He would talk about me at family gatherings, telling more stories about me than any of the other five kids. It was as if I was doing what he wanted to do in his life. When you consider the odds, it makes some sort of sense that out of the six kids, one turned out to be a criminal. It was the same thing in Jimmy's family. He'd been a criminal since he was a kid. The only uh, the only one like that is the Bulger's family. His brother Billy was president of the Massachusetts State Senate for 16 years and later became president of the University of Massachusetts. While another brother, Jackie, was a clerk and magistrate in the Boston Juvenile Court. His sisters were all housewives and professionals of one type or another. Until I got married and moved out of the house, when I came home at night and my clothes were bloody from stabbing or fights or bouncing, my father wouldn't ask me what happened. All he'd say is, "You all right?" And when I'd answer, "Yeah," he'd say, "Give me your clothes," and he'd throw them in the washing machine. He'd give me them back to me when they were done and nothing else was said. I still kept all kinds of weapons in my parents' home: pistols, silencers, machine guns with silencers, assault rifles, hand grenades. Over the years, Jimmy had acquired a lot of weaponry, and I also had also picked up a lot from the streets. People who had stolen guns were always looking to sell them. Jimmy also traveled to New York to buy some. My weapons were locked in the footlocker in my bedroom. When I told my father I'd move them out of the house, he shook his head. "If the cops come here looking for them, I'll say they belong to me." He said, "What are they going to do? Put me in jail?" But 7 years before that, there I was, sitting behind the wheel of Jimmy's Delta 88 at the Mullins Club, staring at Jimmy and his tow truck and wig and mustache. This time he told me to meet him down at Jimmy's Harborside restaurant and to be sure to back the car into the parking lot. I'd, I'd be at the Harborside no more than 15 minutes when Jimmy pulled the tow truck in nose first, so our driver's side windows were facing, and handed me a walkie-talkie and binoculars. The olds already had a police scanner. He told me that Halloran was sitting in the window at the Pier restaurant about 400 yards away from where I was parked, so I'd need to get a little closer. When I was settled, I was to keep an eye on the restaurant and let him know. When Balloonhead got up from his seat, there was no doubt Halloran fit his code name perfectly. with his round melon-shaped head that looked like had been filled with a blast of helium. At 6'4", he was powerfully built and barrel-chested, a big guy. If you ever saw the movie The Brink's Job with Peter Falk made in the 1970s, you might see Brian Halloran. I have no idea from how Halloran got the role. Maybe that from the Teamsters local. When Specs O'Keefe is in jail scene, Halloran plays the prison guard whom hits him from behind. The perfect role for this bully. Before Jimmy took off, I noticed a man in the back seat of the tow truck. Whoa. Of the tow truck, his face hidden behind a dark blue ski mask. He raised himself up and waved at me. I waved back with no idea who he was. Then I drove a short distance to Anthony's Pier 4 parking lot and backed in so I could see the whole front of the Pier restaurant across the street. By then it was 5 or 5:30. I sat in the car, the windows open, trying to look inconspicuous as I moved the binoculars from my lap to my eyes and stared into the window of the restaurant. I kept an earplug in my ear so I could listen to the police scanner without anyone hearing the chatter of the scanner through my open window. I kept wishing I had a hat to change my appearance so no one would be able to recognize me. Unfortunately, there were no hats in Jimmy's Olds. From that day on, no matter what car I was driving, I made sure that I had a few hats available to put on at a moment's notice. That early in the evening, there was nothing particularly interesting coming through the scanner, just the typical domestic violence stuff and a few minor incidents. It's funny, but an ordinary person might not pay much attention to a guy sitting in his car staring at a restaurant through a set of binoculars, but a criminal would. I'd want to get his plate and find out who he was and why he was staked out there. But that spring evening, none of the people walking up and down the waterfront seemed interested in me or what I was doing. And I was grateful that I didn't see anybody I knew. So I kept sitting there, staring straight ahead through the binoculars at the 100-foot separating me from Balloon Head. As I looked at Halloran at the table of 4 having a few beers, I was glad it was him and not me having his last beer. Even though I was carrying a gun at my waist, I was pretty sure I wouldn't be using it. My role was basically the lookout to call the hit in. Not that it made a difference who pulled the trigger. Everyone played a part to make it happen, and I was playing mine. Jimmy had often used the analogy of a finely oiled machine or watch when discussing jobs. Everyone had to do his part for everything to go smoothly. All the little cogs in the watch had to move perfectly. If one wheel stopped or broke, then the watch would stop working. More important than committing the crime was getting away with it. And in order for that to happen, everything had to go just right. It didn't matter who pulled the trigger. The person who called in the hit or drove the car or a crash car or listened to the scanner was equally as important. Crash car. That's like a Sammy Gravano. He always loves to say that. Crash car. There were times when we would stop before the crime was committed, like with a shakedown, because one of us didn't think everything would work perfectly. That afternoon, if I wasn't there to call in the hit, Halloran would have gotten away. My role, I understood from the beginning, was no different than Jimmy's. Just like him, I was committing the murder. I wasn't there for more than 10 minutes when Halloran got up, and the other 3 guys he was with followed suit. I figured they were all leaving, so I called out on the walkie-talkie, "The balloon is rising." A minute later, Halloran came walking out the front door of the pier with another guy in front of him. That guy, who I didn't recognize, was 6 feet tall and heavy set. When he got into a car in the parking lot, I realized Halloran had probably come with him. For a minute, I wondered if this might mean Jimmy would call off the hit. If Halloran had been with a small child, that hit wouldn't have happened, since Jimmy would never have taken the risk of hitting a kid. But I was pretty certain he wouldn't let this one detail of another guy in the car stand in his way of getting the job done. Yeah, you can do it. It's an hour, but yeah, whatever. Okay, this time I gave Jimmy the message, "The balloon is in the air." Knowing he'd understand that meant Halloran was now outside. A minute later, a four-door blue Datsun pulled up. Halloran got into the passenger seat and repeated two or three more times, "The balloon is in the air." I knew from the minute I spoke those words that my life, along with Halloran's, had forever changed. And faster than either of us could ever imagine, Halloran was barely seated in the car when suddenly across the street Jimmy whipped a tow truck next to the Datsun. Halloran was in the passenger seat facing out to the street, and the tow truck was facing the opposite direction. The two-car passenger window to passenger window. It was a beautiful Tuesday night in May, and all kinds of people were still walking around the waterfront, dressed in business suits and casual wear, looking to enjoy the night. Jimmy had the passenger window down on the tow truck, and he slid over and yelled, "Brian!" Halloran turned his giant head, and the shooting began. "Shit," I said to myself. Here it comes." Through the binoculars, I had a clearer look at Jimmy's face, and when he opened his mouth to yell Brian's name, I could see that he was gritting his teeth hard. I also knew that he was using a .30 caliber carbine with a selector switch, so it fired fully or on semi-automatic. As it turned out, although Jimmy thought it was on full, he had forgotten to switch the selector, so it was actually firing semi-automatic. Later on, he said it was better that way because he could place his shots easier. I would say is a well-aimed shots. The whole automatic thing I know from the Army is a pile of crap. So, anyways, I'm going to carry on with this. But the shooter was in the tow truck's back seat, popped up and started firing to using a fully automatic Mac 10 with a silencer. Jimmy had no silencer. The autopsy report would say Halloran was hit 21 times, his driver multiple times. All that made sense since Jimmy emptied a 30-round clip that afternoon. Magazine. Once the shooting started, Halloran's car began drifting across the street, and I could tell the driver, whoever he had been, was gone. The area was still filled with people, lots of them standing in front of another lobster place from across the pier. Most of them panicking, screaming, running and ducking behind cars. A few I noticed seemed paralyzed by the shooting and just stood there, transfixed by the scene around them, staring and not moving, maybe not even realizing their bullets were flying around their heads. Jimmy then made a U-turn out of the parking lot, pulled up near Halloran's car, which was in the middle of the street now, and shot out the open driver's windows. I couldn't believe it when Halloran stumbled out of his car, walking stunned and dazed toward the rear of his car, straight into the path of shots coming at him. He'd been hit everywhere except his head, which later turned out to be a stroke of good luck for Jimmy. At that point, a van drove up and blocked my view, so I pulled out onto the edge of the parking lot and into the street to see what was going on. Halloran didn't look good. There was a lot of blood coming out of his body. He'd taken a hell of a lot of punishment and staggered for yet another few seconds before he finally went down. I could see the shots still going into him while his body bounced off the ground, twitching every time he got hit. Some of the bystanders were crying, probably not about the body, but about being in the line of fire, while others looked terrified as they realized that what had just gone down. As a kid, I'd seen people being stabbed in bars, lots of fights, and more than one violent death, but what I was witnessing now was a scene from a Sam Peckinpah movie, all only in slow motion. It was surreal, and I felt the adrenaline moving through my veins. I glanced at my watch and was surprised to see that the whole thing had taken maybe 90 seconds. The people were still ducking everywhere, yelling, screaming, and hiding behind cars. Jimmy tore away, and a police wagon pulled up 30 seconds later. The driver of the Datsun, who we later learned was Michael Donahue, never got out of the car. Later, people would say, he was an innocent bystander, but just some poor jerk who was offering Halloran a ride home. That's bullshit. Donahue was an unintended, but not an innocent bystander. He was a player who had been involved in the Pappas murder at the Golden Triangle in Chinatown that night. Halloran had shot Pappas in the head, and Donahue had driven him away from the murder. People had a misconception that Donahue, a cop's son, was a legitimate guy. He wasn't, but he died instantly that night with a bullet to the head. When you think about it, Jimmy was a good shot because not one innocent person died that night. As I drove away, I began to hear the calls coming in on the police scanner about shots being fired on Atlantic Avenue. While I was listening to that and thinking about what I was supposed to go next, where I was supposed to go to next. I wasn't sweating or nervous, even though even though it always takes a lot to rattle me. I was still surprised at how calm I felt. I had no worries that we might get caught. Rather, I was just glad it was over and was anxious to get back to some kind of normalcy. After all, this Halloran thing had been going on for about 6 weeks. Not that I ever thought I'd be involved as I was that day. I pulled away from the scene, remembering that Jimmy had told me if anything happened, I should meet him at Capitol Market or on Morrissey Boulevard. So I drove over there and waited 20 minutes, but he didn't show up. I called him on his beeper and punched in the number of a nearby telephone booth that took incoming calls. He called me back and said, "What are you doing?" He said, "I'm at a Capitol Market." I said, "I'm at Teresa's eating," he told me. "Grab something to eat and I'll speak to you later." So I headed over to my in-laws to eat. When I got there, I put on the news at 6 o'clock and I watched it with my wife's family. It was all over the news, gangland slaying at the waterfront. Nobody around me was treating it like it was a big thing, and no one in my wife's family would ever suspect I had anything to do with it. I was hungry, watching the news and thinking, hey, we got away with it. I didn't drink that night, not even a beer, but that wasn't unusual for me since I always like to be in control, especially so that night. Around 9, Jimmy beeped me and told me to bring his car to Teresa's and pick him up. When I pulled up, he got into the driver's side, and I moved over to the passenger side. As always, we didn't talk in the car, assuming it was wired. Jimmy was back to his usual self, wearing his regular clothes, no mustache or wig. He drove us to the scene of the crime to look for a hubcap that had fallen off the tow truck. Really, taking a right up the viaduct ramp that led to the old World Trade Center and driving right back down to where they had all the police lights set up in the criminal scene. We saw the hubcap just where he thought it had landed, right at the corner of the curb, by the curb, less than a quarter of a mile from where the police had set up the crime scene. Jimmy had to take a series of rights to get on the viaduct, but when he got to the spot, I jumped out, grabbed the hubcap, and threw it back in the back seat of the Olds. If the police had found it, they would have linked the model of the car and maybe found a print on it. Not that I was worried about that. You just didn't get worried about around Jimmy. Maybe because he had plenty of nerve, too much nerve. Everybody around him absorbed his energy. Since he was fearless, so you assumed you were going to get away with it, and we did. From there, we drove to Steve Fleming's mother's house, a two-story at 832 East 3rd Street. Stevie had the whole house done over for his parents and put a modern kitchen with all up-to-date equipment. It was a good-sized room with a glass-top kitchen table that seated 4 people. There was a lot of, also a parlor with a couch and a TV across from the kitchen, along with a formal dining room and a bedroom and with a bathroom on the first floor. On the second floor were 2 rooms and a bathroom. Mary Fleming, a short, plump lady, probably in her 70s, her black hair in a bun, wearing a simple house dress, was busy moving around the kitchen, making dinner. Her husband, John, was already in bed, but she was delighted to feed the 3 of us. She spoke good English with a slight Italian accent. It's getting too big, eh? Okay. Where is that? Slight Italian accent. A friendly little lady who liked everybody and loved to cook up a big meal. I'd eaten over there a few times before. I'd had Jimmy. That night, Jimmy spoke to Mary for a few minutes. As usual, polite and warm to her. Stevie stayed in the kitchen talking about the day's events, but I went into the parlor, which was right next to the kitchen, to catch the latest news and see what they were saying about the murder. While Jimmy was explaining to Stevie what had happened, I could see Stevie wearing dungarees and a t-shirt, punching his hands together. He was bullshit that he hadn't been there. I didn't know him that well then. But as I got to know him, I understood that Stevie enjoyed a good murder, and that in that way, Stevie was just like Jimmy. Jesus, where am I here? That night, where the fuck did I go? Just like Jimmy, who killed people everywhere, or which way there was, stabbing, strangling, shooting, beating them with the bats, changing up all the time with no rhyme, or reason, using whatever method he thought was best way to kill that particular person. To my knowledge, Jimmy killed at least 4 people, but that night I could feel that things were different because between the two of us. Jimmy knew it too. He'd always said that once a murder was committed, we were all hostages to one another. From then on, I was tied to him as he was tied to me. When I went back into the kitchen to eat, Mary was still busy taking stuff off the stove and putting it on the glass table in bowls, making sure we all ate everything. Jimmy kept telling her how delicious the food was and what an excellent cook she was. Not that every visitor to his house on East 3rd Street got to spend such a pleasant evening at Mary's house. Certainly not her son's beautiful blue-eyed boy, our blonde 26-year-old girlfriend, Deborah Davis. Deborah had been brought to the house as a year earlier because Stevie was worried that she was trying to leave him for some guy she met on vacation in Mexico. It's open to debate exactly who strangled Deborah that night in Mary's basement. Stevie said Jimmy did, but Jimmy told me Stevie kissed her on the forehead and told her she was going to a better place. Where she went was to a grave on the Quincy side of Neposek Bridge, where the train goes over the bridge and where the two of them buried her at low tide. I never met Deborah, but it's public knowledge that she was knock dead gorgeous and 17 when she started to date the 40-plus Stevie. I blame her mother for Deborah's death. What kind of a mother lets her teenage daughter date a man that age, especially a man like Stevie? If I had a teenage daughter and a 40-year-old man showed up at my door, he'd have a problem. He'd be going in the hole. After Deborah got killed, Stevie convinced Jimmy to go on a vacation to Mexico with him. Jimmy told me he didn't realize till he got there that it wasn't a vacation, it was a pilgrimage. Stevie only wanted to trace Deborah's footsteps during her trip so he could find the guy she planned to dump him for and kill him. Jimmy was grateful they never found the guy. I should have been grateful that Jimmy hadn't involved me in the murder. Guess he felt a beautiful girl wasn't the best way to initiate me into murder, but Halloran's killing was. That May night at Stevie's parents' house, Jimmy and Stevie were still discussing Halloran's murder. Stevie was occasionally laughing, and Jimmy was maybe a little more excited than usual, but he was still pretty much typical calm self. Never mentioning the guy in the back seat of the tow truck, Jimmy told Stevie how the gun had stayed on semi-automatic. He would mention how much better it was to place the shots that way. Or how he made the U-turn and fired into the back of the head of the driver. How he didn't realize who the driver was. How the guy's head fucking exploded when he shot through the back window. How he had to go back and get the hubcap. All the while we were chowing down spaghetti and eggplant and veal parmesan. Around 10, the three of us drove over to Castle Island and walked around. It was a beautiful night, but the two of them couldn't stop talking about the murder. God, how much further do I gotta go here? Yeah, we're good. About the murder. A little before midnight, Jimmy dropped off Stevie and took me back to my car, which was back on 3rd Street at the Mullins Club, and I drove home. My wife and I watched some late news, which was the same recap about a gangland slaying. Pam had no idea that I was involved in that murder. She knew I was involved with Jim Bulger, but she knew no particulars about exactly what I did with him. I had no fear of being caught, but I was tired and knew I had to get up to work in the morning. I slept okay and got up early the next morning and went down to breakfast place on K and Broadway. I got the newspaper, sat down in a booth, and ordered eggs sunny side up, an English muffin to drink in the yolk, orange juice, and a coffee. I was reading the newspaper and eating when Jimmy Mantville came over to my table. Mantville, who was in his 40s, 5'9", around 160 pounds, with curly brown hair and in great shape, sat down, looked me straight in the eye, and said, "We finally got him." I just looked at him and smiled, thinking, I know I was there, but I don't remember seeing you unless you were there, the one in the ski mask. He kept talking about Halloran and what a piece of shit he was, how he was a bully who threw his weight around, intimidating people, just taking stuff and never paying for it, pounding on people for no reason, and I listened and continued eating my breakfast. That night I was waiting for Jimmy to tell me to get the tow truck out of the garage and bring it down to the mechanics so he could fix the odometer. But since I hadn't heard from Jimmy about the car, I left it. I left it there. It came out that evening that Halloran had given a dying declaration that Jimmy Flynn had killed him. It turned out to be lucky for Jimmy that he hadn't shot Halloran in the head and that he hadn't died instantly, like Donahue said. When I think about it, I did look at. When I think about it, I did look at like him. Jimmy said, but he hadn't done it on purpose. A few months later, Flynn was in a restaurant when the cops came to arrest him for the murder. He tried to run but they chased him and took him away. He went to trial but was found not guilty. No surprise there. On Friday night after the murder, around midnight, Jimmy beeped me and asked, "Did you take care of it?" Of course, he would never have mentioned the word car. We never talked about anything specific on the phone, but I knew uh, but I knew what he was talking about and said, "No, I hadn't heard from you." "Come on over," he said. I drove over to Quincy, and he met me outside his condo in Louisburg Square. When he asked me if I moved the car, I said no. Thank God for Beck's beer, he told me. It seems the FBI agent John Morris, who was an incompetent wimp, had dropped by, and all Jimmy had in the house to drink was Beck's. When Morris had a few in him, he blurted out that the hit car was a bore job, meaning the engine was bored out, souped up, worked up. Apparently, an FBI agent who had been assigned to Halloran had been down the street at the time of the murder and had watched the whole thing and gotten the plate, which was legally registered but in a fictitious name. As it turned out, that particular agent died of cancer 6 months later. But now that they were just waiting for the car he had seen to surface, and it would have been me driving the car when it did. So we left the car where it was until Jimmy had it moved and chopped it with without anyone seeing it. Within 2 weeks of the murder, it was gone, but it had fulfilled a mission and gotten Jimmy away from the scene. There was never any reason for Jimmy to create another car like that. After that murder, he changed his MO, sucking people in, meeting in houses, and making them come to him. He didn't need a hit car for that. That was Jimmy's brilliance, always finding a better way to do the job. One afternoon, Jimmy and Stevie and I drove over to the tow lot on Dorchester Avenue to take a look at the Datsun. As always, when the three of us went anywhere together. Jimmy drove. Stevie sat in it in the passenger seat, and I was in the back seat. That was fine with me. I wouldn't have wanted Stevie sitting in the back of me. Jimmy walked right up to the driver's side of the Datsun, opened the door, and hit the back of the headrest with his hands. As he did that, a piece of scalp with some hair attached to it fell off, a little piece of Donahue that police had missed. You could see the holes where the bullets had ripped through the doors and the windows. It was a mess with blood all over the place, on the seats, on the roof, on the floor. The car was shredded like Swiss cheese, with gaping holes everywhere. As we looked at the car, I was thinking about how much punishment the human body could take. Donahue might have gotten hit in the head and died instantly, but Halloran had taken 21 bullets, as Jimmy commented again, and again about how he had placed the shots through the rear window into Donahue's head. Stevie walked around looking at the car, shaking his head, still pissed he had missed out on the murder. Finally, Jimmy said, "Let's get out of here," and we took off. A few months later, I stopped working for the T. From that point on, I worked for Jimmy full time. All right, so wow. That was an hour and 26 minutes of reading. No one watching. That's okay. Like I said, I'm doing it for me, I guess. So, but yeah, he sure gets himself into some big trouble here. This guy, Jimmy. Anyways, yeah, that brings us to page 76, and we'll be moving on to the next chapter, which is chapter 4, learning the business. The business, loan sharking, extortion, and murder. Well, that ought to be interesting, eh? Okay, so I'm going to wrap it up. I guess I've gone on for an hour and 27 minutes to myself here. Remember, you could always watch this in the rerun, and give it a thumbs up. Not everybody can read for that long. And be sure to subscribe, leave a comment, and have a good weekend. See you on Christmas or tomorrow.